David Walker is the nation's chief auditor, and he's fed up. The United States federal budget, he says, is unworkable and irresponsible. At an alarming rate, the nation is incurring debt that future generations will have to repay, with interest. Will they be able to? No, Mr. Walker says, not unless the country establishes much stronger budget controls, revamps the tax system, and rethinks all entitlement programs, including Medicare, Social Security, and farm price supports. Mr. Walker insists this important work has got to be done, and he has ideas about how to make that happen. Those ideas involve every American. On a sunny fall day in Denver, he explained where we stand as a nation financially and where we need to head.
You know, what people don't realize is that while we don't face a catastrophic short-term event, we've been diagnosed with fiscal cancer. And that means that we can't continue a status quo scenario. We need to change our behavior. And in 2008, we have a critically important presidential election. And it's very, very important that the next president, male, female, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, that they make fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity one of their top 3 priorities. That means tough budget controls, Social Security reform, healthcare reform, tax reform, re-engineering and reinventing government. If they do that, we can turn this thing around.
If nothing changes, Mr. Walker says we have 2 choices if we'd like to see the federal budget balanced by 2040. People often ask Mr. Walker if the nation can grow its economy enough to head off its long-term fiscal problems. Sure, he says, but the United States would need 75 consecutive years of double-digit economic growth. Well, how hard could that be? Remember the go-go 90s when it seemed everyone was making money during the tech boom? Well, even then, annual economic growth for that decade averaged 3.2%. So where does the nation spend its money? In 2006, Social Security and Medicare Medicaid consumed 40% of the nation's spending. It won't be until next year, 2008, that the first wave of nearly 80 million baby boomers turn 62 and are eligible to claim early retirement Social Security benefits. More than half of the nation's spending in 2006 was essentially on autopilot. Discretionary spending is where Congress gets to make decisions and has the flexibility to direct money to areas where it's needed now. That 38% of the budget, which covers things such as the FBI, scientific research, and national parks, is very important and does need to be spent wisely. But it is not what is driving the nation's long-term fiscal problems. Those problems are instead wrapped up in mandatory spending, which includes Social Security and Medicare. Mandatory spending is dictated by legislation, eligibility rules, and benefit formulas. In other words, Congress will have to tackle the tough job of restructuring entitlement programs if it wants to change the amount of money spent on them.
If you take fiscal 2006 as an example, depending upon which set of numbers you want to use for the federal government's deficit for the year, you get a low of $248 billion or a high of $450 billion. Politicians obviously talk about the low number, but that $248 billion is basically the net cash deficit. But guess what? The government spends every dime of the Social Security surplus on other government operating expenses. So the real cash operating deficit in 2006 was $434 billion. And for the $161 billion number that's tentatively been announced for 2007, add another $170 to $180 billion on top of that, because we spent that Social Security surplus too. So we need to be careful to make sure that we understand the true situation.
The United States is on the hook for big bucks. This is a look in trillions of dollars at how much its financial obligations climbed between 2000 and 2006. The first column, known to accounting types as explicit liabilities, is money that must be paid and is currently being paid. It includes things such as military and civilian government pensions. The second column is what we might have to pay or expect to pay. The more formal term is commitments and contingencies. This money covers things such as federal insurance programs and goods and services the United States has ordered but hasn't received, such as new military aircraft. The third column represents the nation's implicit exposure. This is essentially what Americans imply they will pay given the current design of the programs that fall into this category. Those programs include Social Security and Medicare. By doing nothing to restructure or overhaul their national budget, Americans essentially agreed in 2006 to pay a total of $50.5 trillion over the next 75 years. So what might your share of $50.5 trillion look like? And how would you like to pay that? By 2040, spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will be the equivalent of approximately 16% of the nation's economy. A seismic demographic shift is affecting the nation's long-term fiscal outlook. By 2030, the number of Social Security beneficiaries is expected to shoot to 84 million people from today's caseload of 50 million.
But healthcare is a huge problem. It's not just demographics. Healthcare costs are going up 2.6% faster than the economy. And if there's one thing that could bankrupt America, it's healthcare cost. We're going to have to reform our entire healthcare system in installments over a number of years because there's no way we can sustain the status quo, and some real tough choices are going to have to get made. But we need to make sure that in reforming healthcare that we're focusing on meeting broad-based societal needs that are affordable and sustainable over time rather than unlimited individual wants that could bankrupt America. You've got to keep in mind, everybody wants unlimited health care as long as somebody else will pay for it.
And who is going to pay for it? There aren't enough workers in the pipeline to replace all of the boomers who are retiring. By 2030, only slightly more than 2 workers will be left to shoulder the costs of entitlement programs supporting every retiree.
One of the things that people need to realize is that, Social Security is going to be here indefinitely. Medicare is going to be here in some form indefinitely. Although the younger you are, the more they're going to be changed. And the younger you are, the more you're going to have to assume more responsibility for your own financial health and your own retirement security. We at GAO have noted within the last 2 months that state and local governments in the aggregate are likely to face growing operating deficits within the next 10 years due to several reasons. Medicaid cost, unfunded retiree health care for state and local workers, underfunded pension plans for state and local workers, and deferred maintenance cost for critical infrastructure as well as additional infrastructure needs. And quite frankly, in Colorado, you have another challenge. You have a limit on how fast revenues can go up based upon the size of the population and inflation. And while the citizens of Colorado voted for a 5-year stay of that limit, presumably eventually it's going to have to be dealt with again. So the numbers, frankly, just don't come close to working at the federal level. Quite candidly, based upon speaking with your state auditor and your state treasurer here today in Denver, they don't come close to working at the state level either over the long term. So we have to reimpose tough budget controls. We've got to speak truth to the American people about where we are and where we're headed, the consequences of inaction, the need for action. We've got to be able to reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We've got to reform our tax system. We're going to have to basically step back and figure out what's the proper role of government in the 21st century to reprioritize, re-engineer, and make sure that we're separating the wheat from the chaff between which government spending programs and tax policies are working and which ones aren't, which ones are generating value for money, which ones aren't, who's benefiting from it, who's not. So the bottom line is, our situation is worse than advertised. We don't have a short-term problem. In fact, in many ways, because things are in pretty good shape in the short term, that gives us a false sense of security, and it makes the degree of difficulty in trying to do what's necessary to deal with our large and growing long-range problem that much tougher, because this is not just an issue of numbers. It's not just an issue of values, stewardship being an important one. It's also a moral issue, because we are mortgaging the future of our country, our children, and our grandchildren at or near record rates, and it's set to get a lot worse. And guess what? A lot of those can't vote. That's just not right.